facilitate examined lives. You may have just received we are recording notice. That's our indication that we hope to post the video of this session online. And if anybody has any objections to that, please let us know now. All right, seeing none. So again, for the newcomers, Examined Lives is a forum for exploring fascinating questions in a deeply collaborative way. And just to sketch that approach briefly, what we want to do is have lots of turn taking, lots of short, shiny, finely crafted observations and insights, and then the relinquishing of the floor so that we get other people talking. Okay, we're going to try to move along. We don't want speeches. Be brief and try to build on the contributions of others. Turns out that if you practice those simple principles, you can get some conversations that are really, truly remarkable. So please join us in contributing to that ethos. Our topic today is weaponized stories, which relates to the science of what's now being called, I think, narrative psychology. We in Examined Lives here like to bring an evolutionary perspective to some of these questions, and we encourage not just that perspective, but others as well. I'm going to say a little bit about the topic and then turn you loose. Most of what I've thought on this subject was triggered by two books that I admire deeply. One is called The Storytelling Animal by Jonathan Gottschall. It came out several years ago. And his more recent book, The Story Paradox, which purports to expose the dark side of stories and how stories can be used to disorder minds. The story he tells, I'll just try to sum it up as best I can. Human beings evolved to love stories. Stories have a unique capacity to shape our minds. In a sense, a story is like a simulation. It's like a way of reading a story or hearing a story told is a way of running a mental simulation. And in this simulation, you'll have a protagonist who confronts a problem, does something to try to resolve that problem, and either succeeds or fails. And of course, any bundle of information shaped in that way will carry a lesson about what works to solve problems. And so Gottschall's hypothesis is that stories were a powerful cultural innovation that dovetailed with our evolved psychology to enable us to kind of run mental simulations, learn from them, and to codify knowledge of cause and effect, knowledge of what works to resolve problems. And it's not hard to imagine that bundles of information that take roughly that shape might be unusually sticky and unusually transmissible. While largely in love with stories in the earlier book, Gottschall has been thinking hard lately about the possibility that false narratives and divisive narratives can be enormously influential in terms of disordering our minds. And I think in today's day and age, with the big election lie and claims that climate change is a hoax, that Biden stole the election, right, that COVID is a giant conspiracy, each of these claims is a story reduced to its essence. And these stories seem to be getting an enormous amount of attention and having an enormous influence quite beyond their merits. And so there's a whole bunch of questions that follow in the wake of this. But I think we might want to start with Gottschall's claim that stories are dangerous because they circumvent rational thought and therefore create tools for sort of weaponized, for unhinging our capacity for reason. So I'm going to shut down. I'm going to shut up there so we can get other folks, get your perspectives on this. One good way to let me know that you have a desire to speak would be to use the reactions button at the bottom of your screen. If you raise your hand, I will know that you have something to share. And Ben here is going to start us off and also exemplify the virtue of brevity for all of our sakes. Thank you, Ben.
I think it's an interesting idea that, you know, stories are the issue, that stories are the problem. If they expose an innate capacity within us or an innate nature within ourselves to rely on this type of information, is it the story that's the issue, or is it like that, like, is it like, why would it be removing the story? The story would be the problem if it's an innate capacity within ourselves and how we interpret and understand information.
So it may be there may be problematic stories, but our susceptibility to stories may also be problematic. I like that. Thank you, Ben. Very nice. David.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just as you were laying that out, this this insight suddenly popped into my mind. You know, life and humans, particularly humans, we evolved to learn from our experience, you know, not from books and rational arguments. And so a well-told story brings the image into mind. It's relatively similar to lived experience. And lived experience we don't question. I mean, that's that's reality, that's fact, and we absorb it in all these ultimately then dysfunctional ways, or can.
Very nice. Yeah, I think Gottschall puts a similar point as stories kind of disarm us, right? They make us, we want to trust a storyteller, and maybe sometimes trust storytellers more than we ought. Thank you, David. Nice. Rob.
In 1968, Norman Holland wrote a book called The Dynamics of Literary Response, in which he posits that the reader brings a great deal to the reading of what they read, and therefore much of what's going on, I think this goes to Ben's comment, that half of what happens in the mind when we read a narrative is produced by our own mind. And my second question, my question is, I propose, isn't it true that all stories in a certain sense are weaponized? That is, they are designed to create an effect. And they may be good weapons or bad weapons, depending on whether we're on that side or not. So that's my question.
Love it. Thank you, Rob. And by the way, it's not just insights, also open questions of the kind Rob is sharing are often very much appreciated here. So thank you. Diane, love to hear from you.
Yeah, just to follow up on Rob's first sentence, people are not blank slate, so to speak, so that a story comes to them.
Diane, I think we've lost the feed. Are other people lost Diane's feed? Diane, it seems your image is frozen up. We're not hearing you, so I'm gonna jump to someone else. We can come back to you, all right? Steve, talk to us.
Well, just to piggyback on what Rob said, and I do recommend reading The Story Paradox. I actually did read the book, and it's one of the best books I've read in the last year. Stories have always been weapons in the sense that their social intent is what Gottschall calls sway, which is to be able to have social influence over other people. That was why they were adaptive. What's changed is our communities and our technologies, so that the weapon that was once adaptive in binding us together when we lived in smaller communities, with larger communities and technology, now tears us apart more than binds us together. So I think the problem is less human nature, perhaps, than we had a session a few months ago on evolutionary mismatch. And I think this is yet another example of evolutionary mismatch.
Very nice. Thank you, Steve. Love it. Ed.
I just wanted to, I haven't read Gottschall's book. I've just heard him talk on Michael Shermer's podcast earlier this week about the topic though. But I don't know that you could separate out storytelling from rational thinking. It's hard to imagine one without the other. And that it reminds me of something I read from Dan Dennett's work that made me start to wonder if storytelling and just consciousness in general are ways we actually extend our rational thinking. And he gave the example of a chessboard. If you put all the pieces out randomly, we're all extremely bad at trying to remember how many pieces are out there. But if you put a typical mid-game out there, experienced chess players can instantly remember where all 32 pieces are on the 64-board chessboard because they can think of the story that got to that place. And that's how they can remember so much more data than they would otherwise, is the story. And the story is what helps us string together all of these other arguments that have gone on along the way. So yeah, that's just my contribution, thoughts and reactions to this.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ed. Terrific. Charles.
Yes, just two quick things. One, to just offer a distinction between weapon and tool. A weapon, well, enough said, just to throw that distinction into the conversation. And the other is just I guess a quick reaction to what seems to elevate the rational mind, which has gotten us into a lot of the mess we're in, as opposed to maybe the imagination or the heart mind, which gives us wisdom to help us move, I think, in many ways. I love the notion, I hadn't heard it before, evolutionary mismatch. I think it's our heart wisdom as much as anything that's going to draw us out of an evolutionary mismatch, if in fact we are drawn out of it.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I like the weapons tools distinction. I suppose it's fair to say that weapons are a kind of tool, but of course not the only kind of tool. And we tend to think of weapons as sort of designed to harm. Perhaps that's even definitive of it. And so some stories are specifically designed to harm, whereas others may, bind us together or exercise sway in more benign ways. Interesting. Thank you, Charles. Diane, we lost you before. Will you come back to your point, please?
Yes, what I was trying to get to was to say that emotions are not only aroused by stories, but I think we select the stories that we prefer to believe in on the basis of the emotions that we've already been conditioned to or had aroused by other stories that we already believe in.
That's a fine point. Wow, I'm loving all the terrific insights and interest in participating. David, join us.
Yeah, thanks. I must confess I was a bit thrown by the framing of the overall question, because it seemed to imply that we were kind of rational beings being corrupted by these tools. When I think of narrative to humans as water is to fish, that our medium is polluted in our view, and there's a mutant species that seems to thrive there. So I think we should ask more about the nature of humans, perhaps, than the nature of stories.
Okay, lovely. Kathleen.
Yeah, I agree with David. To me, the weapon these days, the mismatch problem, has to do with control over the internet. I'm thinking how the Arab Spring got started a lot with people communicating with each other online, and then it got shut down when governments prevented that. And stories are also self-defense. They're the way alternative communities form. And what's frightening to me is not being able to form with stories under an autocracy.
Yeah, and just to connect this with the theme of Gottschall's book, Plato, of course, was particularly worried about the kind of disorder, the way in which stories could disorder minds. So when he was talking about the sophists and rhetoricians damaging ancient Athens, he had in mind, I think, primarily the storytellers. And he offered sort of kind of Platonic dialogue, or critical dialogue as a way of keeping our stories in check. So I agree that the line between stories and rational thinking is not always easy to make out. But Plato and the way Plato tells stories of dialogues unfolding in his work, but those stories often involve his hero, Socrates, deconstructing a narrative or deconstructing the assumptions upon which prevailing narratives rest. So perhaps there's a partial antidote there to the more harmful stories. Al, talk to us.
Andy from the UK, back again. Yeah, I just wanted to, as usual, throw in the memes eye view, that stories are actually competing in a narrative ecology for their own benefit, and that's the fittest, whatever that means. Stories are the one which are more pervasive and spread and are effective.
A really nice thought, and I know that our friend Joe Velikovsky from Down Under has done some work in this area. Joe, would you care to share your concept of a nareme and tell us a little about that?
Oh, thanks, Andy, and Andy Lord as well. In my 2016 PhD, which was on movie narratives and creativity, I ended up having to analyze films in terms of the structure of the units. So I would look at 40 different movies in terms of the whole movie as one unit and one story. And within that, maybe there's 3 or 5 or 7 acts. So that's one level down, smaller. Within the acts are sequences of scenes. Within sequences of scenes are individual units called scenes, which is part of a story. Going further down, you have story beats, as they're called by directors and actors, which is moments in a scene. And then you keep going down the scale in size, and you eventually end up at a still frame in a movie. So like a photograph as one unit of culture. And beyond that, the pixel, like the little dots, black and white, that make up a picture. So in a nutshell, I had to look at what are these units of story I'm comparing between these 40 movies, and ended up coming up with this theory called the holon parton structure of the unit of culture, which also applies to the unit of story. So I just put in the chat an article that was in my PhD if anyone's interested in reading more. But going back to Andy Lord's point, you can then start looking at these units, whether it's a scene from a movie or a line from a movie. The one rule of Fight Club, first rule of Fight Club, you don't talk about Fight Club, or say QAnon, where we go one, we go all. These little units of culture, like Andy Lord suggests there, some of them spread more virally than others, and can take over the minds of people whose perhaps critical faculties aren't quite where they should be. And for that, I'd recommend Andy's book, Mental Immunity, which Ed just wrote a great review of, which you should post a link in the chat there, Ed, if you've got time.
Yeah,
thanks,
be
both
nice.
Andy.
Thank you, Joe. Yeah, I think the idea that stories are unusually transmissible units of culture, and ways of structuring information for their to help them proliferate. I think that idea has got a lot of power to it, and I'm really grateful to Joe's work in that area. I see Hank. I don't think we've heard from you yet. Charles and Andy, I see your hands are either still up or up again. I'll come back to you, but Hank first.
Yeah. Hi. Wonderful to hear all these observations and comments, and it's a a wonderful topic. Just as a psychoanalyst and psychotherapist, I wanted to comment on it on a practical level. On one level, it's like you're working with an individual, a couple, or a group of people, and basically we're listening to their stories and how their stories, or Freud called it transference, whatever you want to call these things. It's sort of the perpetuation of stories, and that in neurobiology of the brain, these stories get stored. And these stories are always influencing us. So those are the neuroscientists have been talking about it. And then, so the other part is, so when we were taught as therapists, you go, well, which story is your theory is some form of story. So what theory influences you? Do you have pragmatic or about it? The other is that, and then, so when you're working as a clinician, you're wondering about, okay, which theory or which view of life or what story is going to help me understand this person? But then you got to be aware you're imposing your own story on how you're observing the others. So because I can do it, yeah.
Thank you, Hank. One word Hank used that caught my ear, the idea of imposing stories. There was some work in my discipline of philosophy about whether narratives are always misleading because they invariably impose a plot on a reality that is never pre-plotted. So here's a quick and dirty argument for why narratives are always problematic. The real world doesn't have any plots in it. Narratives impose a plot on the retelling of, say, of history or whatever. Therefore, they're invariably mislead us. Now, I think that argument is way too quick and dirty and problematic. In fact, I've written articles about why that argument is problematic, but I do think there's something to it. We're thinking about. Sage, talk to us.
Sorry, there, my video. So I wanted to share the idea of cognitive attractors or cognitive attraction, which is another way of thinking about these units of ideas or symbols, stories. And it's kind of a way to describe, well, why are the things that we observe, stories that we do share and see around, why are those the ones we share, as opposed to the infinite variations there can be? There's been work on like Little Red Riding Hood, and you see the variants of that story. It's actually often influenced. They replace the characters, the animals, with the local ecology. They don't just do everything. So there's just a limited set, and you could explain the emotional valence or the, cultural valence of a story or idea. And it's a helpful alternative, I think, to what is the difference between, I was thinking about this in terms of stories versus like rational kind of description, in that a rational description must be so, or it tries to be, it's externally defined, like here's the reason why this has to be the story I'm telling you. There's a reason for it. Whereas other than that, narratives in general are guided by these other forces we often don't examine. And cognitive attraction or cultural attraction, it's like you see these clusters and you say, well, wait a minute, there's only a few kinds of this story. What happened to all the others? If I try to tell that story, it may be a rational version. It won't ever hook on because I'm missing all the key features that make
Fascinating. Thank you, Sage. Let's see, Bob, I'd like to hear from you. What's the word from Portugal, Bob?
Well, this is all great. I really enjoy hearing everyone's perspective on this. And I wanted to come back to a couple of things that you referred to. One, most recently, that was the plot, the concept of the plot. I think it's important to think about that in its most basic form and most ubiquitous, most universal form, which might be thought of as beginning, muddle, resolution. And most good, all sacred stories follow that plot pattern. and all myths do and all movies do, because the point of those stories that do follow that plot line is to get to go through the muddle to get to the resolution. Now, going back to something else that you mentioned in your opening comments, which I thought was really great, a way of framing everything here. You mentioned both unitive narratives and disunitive narratives. And one of the things we're seeing now is that what we might think of as what we do think of as disunitive narratives are that because they stop in the muddle portion of the story. They don't go on to the resolution. So that's one thing to think about. I also wanted to come back to use those 2 points that you started out with, unitive stories and disunitive stories, because that's really the heart of what I'm getting at in my new book, which will be out later this year. But the start of that idea goes back to the beginning of time, and I think we can see that there is what I might think of as a trifold trajectory of stories, or 3 phases that stories have gone through. So
Bob, I'm sorry, with a number of people lining up here, I'll ask you to give us the short version, all right?
Okay, well, okay, I can come back later if there's time, but I don't know if there is a short version, but we can go back to see what happened at in the Garden of Eden. That was not just a fall from grace, that was a fall from wholeness with the eating of the forbidden fruit. Same thing with the opening of Pandora's box. And that was also the beginning of two kinds of stories, the ones that you referred to, disunitive and unitive.
Okay.
And I think we're coming back now. There's been a lot of talk about the new story that we're living into now. So I think while both have been in existence forever, we're coming back to a realization of the need for a new story that is a unitive narrative that includes the wholeness, that sees the wholeness of all things.
I hear you.
And that will bring us, that will actually, when we come back to that unitive story that includes the wholeness of all things, that will be so powerful that it will not allow really the disunitive stories to have the power that they have been having recently.
Gotcha. Okay, terrific. Thank you, Bob. Yeah, I think that distinction between unitive and disunitive is really helpful here. Kurt.
Yeah, this kind of follows a little bit on what Bob said as well. You know, I noted in the chat that I'm going to be hosting this program on Voice America with Deepak Chopra and Greg Braden and a lot of other writers, and that meme on the power of telling our spiritual stories. And I was thinking then, well, what is that compared to what we're talking about? What's interesting is that you could characterize that discussion as saying, well, there's not a lot of empirical data in those stories, but there's also not a lot of empirical data in QAnon and other conspiracy theory stories. So then what's the difference? What's interesting is that when you're talking about the stories that we'll be talking about, you're actually drawing those stories from the great wisdom traditions, or as you did from Plato, from the perennial philosophies, and you're trying to motivate people toward good or altruistic behavior, which is really going then from the muddle to the resolution. Whereas the QAnon and the other non-empirical based stories, they're actually coming from not a lot of empirical data. It's more, you know, just metaphysical, but it's again oriented toward misbehavior. So I just found that was an interesting clarification in my own mind.
Yeah, thank you, Kurt. I'm seeing, I believe John Steiner, but I may be getting your name wrong, but
no, you have me right, and my video isn't working. There it goes. So first of all, this is a great conversation, and one throwaway line, which is so generic, is life happens and then we make up stories. But following on what Bob said and Kurt said, what interests me are the stories that are emerging that might helpfully get us through these democracy and climate and survival challenges we're facing. And what are the ones that have a chance to make it and get spread across our various memes and ideologies even. And I'd be interested in a follow-up conversation just on kind of what stories might or are working.
What story might reunify such a divided world? Fascinating. Love the question.
Very much better said. Thank you.
Well, not at all. It was all your ideas. Steve, Andy, and Joe, I see you guys, but Lucas hasn't had a shot yet, so I'm going to let him go next.
This has been fascinating so far. So I'm a sociologist by training with a bit of background in philosophy, and I've become really interested in conspiracy theories, as I think many people have lately. What kinds of stories are these? What's the subset of stories look like? And I'm really concerned with how they play out in terms of practical consequences at the social level because of my background. And I've concluded they're political tools, and why they're not good tools, they're not well-made tools, is because they're ultimately disempowering. They lead us to make decisions that are not in our best interests, or maybe not in the interests of even a group of people who is following along with them. I think of the January 6th insurrection and how a lot of those people are in prison now, right? Because these tend to consolidate the power of one group by sowing mistrust, or they tend to lead us to take action out of fear, out of anger, based on hasty generalizations. And we don't examine the intentions or motives of others very carefully. We build up the scary enemy, and we go to work, and we end up making all kinds of terrible missteps in the process. And I've been really interested to learn what other disciplines have to say about this. I'm really grateful to be here to hear some of your thoughts on that too.
Wow, well, Lucas, I thought there's so much that's interesting and useful there. The idea that the peddlers of false narratives are actually disempowering and using the people who buy into those narratives. I mean, the QAnon, the big election line, I mean, Donald Trump is clearly using a false narrative to manipulate his own followers. And that might be a pattern that's played out again and again whenever stories are used to ultimately, rally troops, but only by misleading, disempowering, and in the end, using them. Steve.
A while ago, somebody asked a question about whether stories distort reality. They do, in the sense that all stories are necessarily reductionistic. So by definition, they distort reality in that way. But what's more interesting is that they're reductionistic in the same way. Gottschall talks about what he calls a universal grammar of stories. And one of the experiments he cites in the book that's quite fascinating is they show a video to subjects of random geometric shapes moving around a screen, and people impose a narrative on that. And the narrative is exactly what all our stories are. There's a hero, there's a villain, there's a resolution. Things tend to end happily ever after. And conspiracy stories use that universal grammar as well. And again, what concerns me the most is at this point is Gottschall uses the term storyverse. He says we all live in a storyverse, and we used to live in the same storyverse, but we now live in multiple storyverses. And he refers to Facebook as a narrative distribution platform. So again, what concerns me the most is that what I said earlier, this mismatch between our natural storytelling instincts and the universal grammar we use in the new technological environment that make it a force that rends us apart rather than brings us together.
Wow. Andy Lord.
Yes, I want to see how many people are familiar with a call which was put out about 10 years ago. I was very interested by the title of this particular thing tonight, Weaponized Storytelling. There was a call put out by DARPA, the American
Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. There, it's a funding arm of the Department of Defense, I believe.
That's exactly the one, yeah. And they put out a call called The Science of Storytelling. I'm just wondering how many people saw that, or for that matter, answered it.
Is this something you could put a link to in the chat? Because it sounds like something some of us.
Just had another look for it. It's going back a bit. And I can't really find very much follow-up from that. So, you know, they're a top secret agency, essentially. They didn't put anything much out back into it, but it was a call in Wired, going back to 2011.
In Wired, okay.
Yeah.
I know a little bit about the the U.S. Defense Department's attempts to study disinformation campaigns and what they call influence campaigns. Goes all the way back to the 1950s, I believe. But the psychology of disinformation campaigns, what works to persuade people to adopt views that, you know, go against their own interests or their nation's interests. There's a lot of interesting research that some of it Defense Department funded going back years. And it sounds like they got interested in stories and their power to influence years ago. Thank you, Andy. I hope somebody, if we have anybody who's really good at tracking down such things and they would want to take on the job of finding a link for us, that would be terrific. Okay, Kathleen.
I think that video was called the Hyder Simul illusion. I'm teaching a course, I'm going to be teaching the first day today on characters. I'd be really interested, you know, we keep talking about stories, but for the most part, stories involve people-like entities. And I'd be interested in your take on that, because the Hyder Simul illusion, a lot of people respond very strongly to one figure appears to be bullying another figure. And I think that there's this issue of positive self-illusions that people have. And if they're feeling low status in a group or society, and a story comes along that turns them into either the victims or the heroes, and you know, it's kind of plays on, you know, the need for status that we talked about the last time. So I'm wondering if we could just talk maybe more about characters. You know, stories involve people or people-like entities.
Yeah, terrific. Pick up on a couple of things there. If you haven't seen the Hyder Simul video, do track it down on YouTube. It's basically just a bunch of triangles and circles and squares moving around a screen. And for some reason, we actually see big circles as trying to intimidate little circles. And the fact that our minds impose such narratives on mere geometrical objects is really quite startling. It's worth checking out there. That's to just add something to what Kathleen said early on. But as far as characters go, I don't know of any good stories that without a protagonist. And of course, protagonists always exhibit agency or the lack thereof to either muddle through the muddle of the story or not, or in whatever way they do. And often the presence of an antagonist or a bad guy can enhance the power of the story. I mean, think about how central to the QAnon story the cabal of Satan worshiping pedophiles are, right? I mean, stories that identify enemies and demonize those enemies seem to have a special power to grab and motivate us, often in destructive ways. Vivek and then Joe.
I think we could make the key distinction between how humans are really rational beings or boundedly rational beings. If we really realize that humans are being boundedly rational, then we could go for heuristic tools as an immunity against the regressive stories, I think. In my personal experience, I came out of several conspiracy traps by taking single heuristic, that is embracing diversity, embracing pluralism. So if any story that is going against diversity and pluralism, then that is story about otherization of other communities and bringing enemy out of other communities. So I use this diversity as the heuristic in a bounded rationality situation that makes me to escape from getting trapped. Thank you.
Yeah, that's excellent. Joe.
Thanks. Three quick things. I put the YouTube link in the chat to whatever it was, the Hyder Simul. Kathleen, what was it? Or Andy, what's the name of that? Those geometrical shapes that Gottschall talked about.
Kathleen, can you clarify?
Hyder Simul. I think it's called Hyder Simul. Simul's right. I'm not sure about the Hyder. Heider or something like that.
But Hyder Simul is right.
Hyder is right.
And I just going back to your introductions, Andy. I personally went through a similar journey to Gottschall, I think, falling more in love with science than stories after a while. I like Gottschall's definition of story on his page 52 of the storytelling animal. A story equals a character plus a problem or predicament plus attempted solution or attempted extrication. So that can be a useful tool if you're ever looking at a sentence or a paragraph or a book or anything and wondering, is this a story? Look for a character or characters, their problem, and how they try and solve it. Obviously, sometimes they don't and get dead.
And then there's the outcome, right? The outcome of their effort.
Exactly. And I shifted over to Popper, his book, All Life is Problem Solving. And I started looking at the lens of The Hero's Journey by Joseph Campbell, and then later compressed by Chris Vogler to 12 Steps, which Star Wars and every big budget Hollywood movie ever since used as a story template. I used that same template. Sorry, I redescribed the hero's journey, whether it's 33 steps or 12 steps or even Popper's 3 steps of science, as the scientific method. Because when scientists try to solve a problem, whether it's Einstein, Newton, anybody, there's a character and there's a problem, and then there's finally a solution, or not, like Einstein in the last 20 years of his life. Anyway, so I wrote an article for the Journal of Genius and Eminence applying that 12-step template to Darwin's life in solving evolution and to Stanley Kubrick's life and life work in probably being one of the greatest geniuses of cinema ever. So I like to use the scientific template of story rather than so much the narrative aspect. But one third point is quickly, a chapter I highly recommend is chapter 20 of Harari's 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. It's called Meaning, Life is Not a Story. And he really drills down to show how we are evolved to tell stories, and even our ego tells a story about our own life. But reality is not really a story, or science is really not a story. It's a bunch of statistics and probability and evolution, and then we weave narratives through. What I like is the following chapter. He talks about meditation and how that's a useful tool to separate yourself from the narrative or the story of your own life or any other stories in your life. So yeah, just highly recommend chapter 20 of 21 Lessons.
Yeah, and I think you can see there from Joe's mention of the title of that chapter, stories seem to have an unusual power to lend meaning to things. So when you just see a disjointed collection of facts, it's really hard to attach significance. But if you can, I mean, I think Ed was saying this before, but to the extent that you can draw a narrative thread, a storyline, a plot line through a set of facts, those facts will stick and stay with you in other ways. It's worth asking, I think, what needs do stories fill? I mean, if Ed's right about that, they help us retain, they help us add structure to what's otherwise might be a bloomin' buzzin' confusion. But I think we also need our own lives to make sense. We want our own style. We want to be able to tell a compelling story about our own lives, preferably one where we're a hero. Ed, you want to pick up on that?
Yeah, I just had a really quick point from I'd heard a wonderful quote on a podcast recently that I wrote down for my own fiction writing efforts. It's from the author Don DeLillo, and he said, "I think fiction rescues history from its confusions." Again, fiction rescues history from its confusions. So yeah, that's perfectly encapsulates that, looking backwards and not really understanding what happened, and so we have to weave this story together, and that sort of rescues us from feeling confused and feeling unsure about what's going on in the world. And you know, I like this what JT was talking about, you know, turning to science for his stories. That's great, except our scientists haven't been trained in storytelling. That we have the separation of the two cultures that keep scientists from wanting to take on this role. It almost pollutes their position if we turn them into storytellers. They feel they have to stay neutral. But really, we need storytellers to weave that scientific story into a meaning to rescue us from our confusions, possibly.
Nicely put. I'm seeing several hands up and also noticing that we're coming towards the end of the hour. I need to save time for a vote on our topic for next time. But Rob, you've been waiting a good while. I'd like to hear what you have to say.
I think I just wanted to make a cautionary comment, and I'll do this very briefly. Some years ago, there was a anthropological experiment where they read narratives by non-Western indigenous cultures to American college students, and then an hour later asked them to repeat the story back to them. And they always changed the story so that it would fit the Aristotelian three-act structure. Always. So we should probably be a little bit careful about how we say story has one structure that serves all people. Sometimes it's different.
Interesting. Fascinating. Diane, Hank, I do see you. I'm going to run our topic vote and hope to come back. Hope we'll have a few minutes at the end to come back to you. So for newcomers here, we like to together choose a topic for our subsequent gathering. So next month, we will be meeting on February 17th. You might want to put this on your calendar, 12 noon Eastern, which can translate to what, 4 a.m. your time, JT, and down under? JT is hardcore. He gets up in the middle of the night to join us, for which we love him dearly. All right, so I'm going to suggest 3 topics that we might discuss next week, and I typically take one topic suggestion from the floor, and then we'll use what we call approval voting to pick one. So you'll get a chance to vote for as many as you like. So listen through to the topics, and then we'll actually then I'll ask for your votes. When the time comes to vote, please raise your little blue hand in the shows up in the participants window. That's how we'll record your vote. Okay, question number 1, or topic number 1, why do we work? If work is a chore and playing is fun, why don't we just play? What is it about work that makes it something that we allow it to consume so much of our lives? Why is work important? What is work? Why is it important? How does it differ from play? Why do we spend so much time doing it? That's topic number 1. Topic number 2, us versus them, identity, belonging, and conflict. I don't think that one needs a whole lot more explanation. And I think you can probably see ways that ties in with stuff we were talking about today. And my third suggestion would be norms. What are they and how do they work? what do we do with dysfunctional norms? How do we change them? How do we create new norms? Being self-aware about the presence of norms in our lives, I know has had a big impact on me. And I think talking about norms and how we can deal with them more, I don't know, with greater wisdom, I think would be an interesting thing to discuss. Okay, so those are my 3 suggested topics. I am, if you have a topic you think the group would enjoy, this would be the time to suggest it. Anyone? Hank.
Oh, I was going to remark on this, but this is taking things to way off from how we deal with things on kind of cognitive, rational level. But if we can consider doing something on a more personal heart wisdom level, we could begin to talk about what are our sacred stories, what are they, the conscious ones, what are they non-conscious, but they're kind of simmering underneath and can be brought to consciousness, and see if we can risk a dialogue around that. I've done this kind of stuff in my career with all kinds of groups, so it's a kind of more vulnerable thing than operating at this level. But I didn't want to bring it up as this thing, but I just thought I couldn't get the chat to work, so that's what I wanted to.
Okay, would you like that to be considered as a possible topic for next time, Hank?
Yeah.
Okay, I want to give it a handy label. Are we talking about sacred stories? Does that work?
Personal conscious raising about sacred stories.
Personal conscious raising about sacred stories, or sacred stories for short. Okay. All right. Thank you. Okay, so now's the time to record your votes. Again, you can vote for as many as you like. If you vote for all of them, you essentially cancel yourself out. So who would like to discuss work? Why do we work? Okay. All right, hands down, please. Thank you. Topic number 2, us versus them, identity, belonging, and conflict. I'm starting to realize that topics with long subtitles after the colon seem to do well in this competition. If you can pack a lot into your subtitle, that can help your topic succeed at the second stage. Okay, Sage, you have a total there for us? Thank you. And third, norms. What are they? How do they work? Wow. Okay. Just falsified my long subtitle hypothesis, but thanks everyone. And fourth, sacred stories. Hank, put it again how you framed it.
Become more aware of how our sacred stories, conscious or not conscious, influence our daily lives and the way we talk on blogs and the way we interact and how we teach and how we play with our pets. The whole, it's a kind of a generic, but it's a very personal, heart-centered.
Gotcha. So I think the idea here is I'm going to give it my own spin here is just there seem to be deep stories that motivate and drive and organize our lives in ways that we're not always aware of. So can we use deep stories?
Yeah.
Surfacing deep stories, maybe something like that. Okay. Has everyone taken their hand down from before? Okay, now's the time to register your vote for deep stories. All right. Sage, do we have a total?
We do, and it's close between norms and deep stories, maybe 1 or 2 votes there. Deep stories has the lead by a couple, I think.
If it's close, let's do a runoff.
Yeah.
So hands down, please. We're going to ask everybody to pick one of the 2 Kathleen, do you want to register your vote through hand waving? Yeah, if you can't find the reactions button to raise your hand there, wave your hand furiously and we'll do our best to tally it. Okay, who would prefer to talk about norms? What are they and how do they work? All right, and hands down. Who would like to discuss surfacing deep stories? I think we have a winner. All right, I see you, Alan.
Yep.
All right, stories seem to be a favorite topic here, so we're going to stack a couple of sessions on stories right in a row. Moving from weaponized stories to deep stories, which should be interesting. Okay, there's several hands up. I know that a couple of you guys were waiting to get your last licks in on our topic for today. I'll extend our session for a couple of minutes for that purpose. Any last words that people would like to share on this? Gail, would you like to share your thoughts on that?
No, thank you. I forgot to put my hand down.
Okay, gotcha. All right. Kurt, looks like you still have your hand up. Would you like to have the final word on weaponized stories?
Sorry, I was multitasking, so that was an accident.
Okay. All right. We're at the end of the hour. Thank you all for an extremely stimulating session. I enjoyed it greatly. I hope we will see some of our newcomers again next month. We got a really good thing going here, and I want to keep building on it. So if you get a chance, please support this view of life, Sage's organization that makes this possible. And thank you all. Have a wonderful month, and I will see you on February 17th.
If you are new and aren't sure, I sent the link in the chat there just to make sure, put your email and name in there. I got John Steiner, I put you in there, but if you haven't, just make sure to sign up so that you get the email for next month. Otherwise we'll lose you.
So if you got here because somebody else referred you, get your name on that mailing list so that you'll get our future announcements. All right. Thanks, everyone. Be well.